Understanding the U.S. national debt, current trends, and future implications. The U.S. national debt has recently hit a staggering $35 trillion for the first time in history. For hundreds of years, the national debt has only gone up. However, just because the debt increases doesn't mean the cost to pay for that debt always goes up. In fact, until recently, the U.S. government's cost for the debt was actually decreasing for decades. Given that fact, you might actually forgive politicians for reckless spending, because why not if spending more just costs you less? This might be brand new information for some, but don't worry. We will explain exactly what's going on here. Let's start with the debt. The national debt. The U.S. national debt doubles roughly every 10 years. This is what's known as exponential growth. One of the reasons why the national debt has been allowed to grow this fast is because of interest rates. For years, interest rates have actually been falling on average over the long term. However, because of central bank intervention, especially over the last 100 years or so, we've had interruptions in this trend with wild volatility. For example, after a central bank binges on money printing, inflation will spike. Then central banks will have to jack up interest rates in order to try and stop the inflation that they caused in the first place. This is what is happening right now, but it also happened from the 1940s through the 1980s. When we talk about the last 250 years or so, interest rates were falling. Right around the time that the Federal Reserve was started in the United States, there have been interruptions and diversions from the long-term trend, including the giant bond bear market sending interest rates skyrocketing from about 1940 through about 1980. The higher interest rates also affect the government's affordability of debt and their ability to borrow more while spending more. We are starting to see that play out right now. What is the current cost of U.S. debt? So what is the debt costing the U.S. government today? In raw dollar terms, they are paying well over $1 trillion in interest alone. Every single day, the government has to pay off old debt that matures, and they can only do that by borrowing new debt that has a higher interest rate than the one they're paying off. So while they pay more for every dollar of debt, they need more debt to pay for it, aka a debt death spiral. But we can't just look at this in dollar terms, because you always have to ask, compared to what? Let's compare these numbers to GDP, because that gives us a rough estimate of how much money the government can confiscate away from the real economy in order to fund their reckless spending. That's where the real fun starts. U.S. debt to GDP. Looking at the amount of debt that the United States has compared to the size of the economy, GDP, we are currently right where we were following World War II. After the war ended, all the spending stopped. We also saw interest rates rise for 40 years straight. Inflation was rising during that period of time as well, but the debt to GDP ratio got better as government spending dropped, the economy grew, and borrowing slowed down. Those higher rates were also reflected in the amount of money the U.S. government had to spend on interest as a percentage of GDP. The interest cost compared to GDP rose during that entire multi-decade period. This acted as a lid on government spending that allowed the government to deleverage. Even though they were deleveraging from a debt to GDP perspective, the total cost as a percent of GDP for servicing that debt still grew. In other words, the debt got more expensive for them. Starting in 1980, every single one of these trends reversed. Interest rates topped out and headed down for 40 years. Debt to GDP bottomed and headed up for 40 years, and the interest cost compared to GDP fell for 40 years. This is the power of falling interest rates. For 40 years, the United States government could spend more, increase the amount that it was borrowing, so much so that the total debt pile, even compared to GDP, got all the way back up to World War II levels. The cost to keep that debt around, to pay for that debt, kept on shrinking. No matter how much the government spent, funded by borrowing, it didn't matter. Inflation. To put this into a personal finance perspective, imagine you max out your credit card, but don't stop there. You roll the balance over to a new credit card that has a higher limit and a lower rate. Suddenly, you're able to afford to load up on that credit card even more. You have more credit card debt, but it still costs you less. Your minimum payment is actually lower because the interest rate is lower. You keep on doing this over and over again. Every time you max it out, you roll it over to a new card with a higher limit and a lower rate. The problem is you can only go as low as 0, and once you hit 0, you have about maxed it out. That's exactly what happened to the U.S. government in 2020. Interest rates hit about as close to 0 as they could. Now, if you kept on growing your debt, but the cost of paying for that kept on shrinking every time you did that, why wouldn't you continue to grow your debt? That's right, because of inflation. You push this animal a touch too far, and inflation comes roaring to life. That's exactly what happened when they pushed interest rates to zero in 2020 and printed trillions of dollars. Inflation rose from the grave, and now central banks are having to do what they've had to do every time, which is jack up interest rates in order to fight the inflation that they caused in the first place. This is increasing the raw dollar cost of paying for the debt with the interest expense over $1 trillion. It's also increasing it from the perspective relative to GDP. Even the Congressional Budget Office is anticipating that the net interest cost will be almost $2 trillion within the next 10 years. That's with them assuming that there are no drastic changes coming down the road, like a drop in tax income from a recession or an increase in government spending from something like a recession, which over the next 10 years is pretty likely. This is why we are anticipating a massive increase in the percentage of GDP that the government is taking just to maintain its debt pile over the coming years. We are looking at a rocket ship takeoff in real time. The last time the government had to deleverage from a debt to GDP perspective, it took them from 120% at World War II down to about 33% in 1980. This came at the cost of interest expense as a percent of GDP going from about 1.8% all the way up to 5%. If we anticipate a similar move from bottom to top, in order to see the same deleveraging, we would expect an interest cost compared to GDP of 7%. Considering that would be almost half of all of the money that the United States government takes in taxes, we're talking about a substantial amount here. Obviously, we know that if this continues the way that it's going without intervention, it would result in a government default. They should default. That would be the most healthy and helpful for the economy moving forward into the future. But these things are never left alone without intervention. In the 70s, they fixed the problem by demonetizing gold and delinking from the gold standard, robbing the world of its purchasing power. This time, they'll probably fix it by monetizing a huge portion, any or all of the national debt that is necessary, as the Fed does a giant one final round of quantitative easing to let anybody unload that debt that wants to at full price, essentially a debt jubilee for the US government. But for the time being, we are likely to have a more oppressive tax system with the government being a larger and larger burden on the economy, confiscating more wealth, driving up interest rates and inflation for the rest of us.
As always, do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel, All Things Money, to see more content like this.